Over the last 25 years, I have tested thousands of patients for gluten sensitivity and not just celiac disease, and I'm going to share with you what I've learned. Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Wangen, the founder and medical director of the IBS Treatment Center, where we offer Zoom telemedicine to all of our clients. I've probably diagnosed at least 1,000 cases of non-celiac gluten sensitivity and even wrote the first book on the topic in 2007. So let's talk about how that's done. In some respects, testing for gluten sensitivity is relatively easy, but like everything else in healthcare, there are all kinds of exceptions and challenges. The best way to test for reactions to gluten is with antibodies. Antibodies are produced by the immune system to fight things like viruses and bacteria. But you do not normally produce antibodies against food because you don't want to be fighting your food. But when you are producing antibodies against food, that is a problem. And it's a message from your immune system that something is going wrong. Now, one of the oldest and easiest to access tests for gluten sensitivity has been the blood tests for anti-gliadin, IgA, and IgG antibodies. Gliadin, which some people pronounce gliadin or gliadin or whatever, doesn't really matter. Pronounce it any way you want. But that is a component of gluten. And 20 years ago, doctors would run these all the time. And I actually have no idea why, because 99% of them didn't pay any attention to the results if the tests for celiac disease were negative. So what that would mean is those patients would not test positive for celiac disease, they would be negative, but they'd have these anti-gliadin antibodies floating around that were positive, and doctors would normally just go, whatever, ignore it, we don't care. But fortunately for me, those tests were being run because that's when I could readily tell if somebody was reacting to gluten when I saw an IgA or IgG anti-gliadin antibody in the blood. Now, if it was positive, then I knew right away there's a gluten sensitivity, what we call a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. However, that's not the only way to test for gluten sensitivities, and it also isn't guaranteed to always pick up all different types of gluten sensitivity. Now, you can also test for antibody reactions in the blood, like we were talking about, the IgA and IgG antibodies. You could test for those against wheat and spelt and rye and barley, and even gluten itself, not just gliadin. And these IgG and IgA antibody tests will usually pick up these gluten reactions, and they can pick up gluten reactions that aren't even specific to gliadin. Now, that's very helpful because that actually happens quite a bit. But sometimes all of these blood tests will still be negative and you'll still have a gluten sensitivity because blood is not the only place where you can find antibodies. Right? So it's not the only place you can measure an immune reaction to a food. Antibodies also show up in the stool. And the stool antibodies can be positive even when the blood antibodies are negative. So we like to look there too, because many times I've seen where the only positive test for gliadin or gluten antibodies was in the stool test. Now, that's not all. It gets even more interesting. You can react to things in wheat other than gluten. All right, so you're going, what? Yeah, there are a lot of other components to wheat than just gluten. You never hear about them, nobody really talks about them, but there's all kinds of other stuff in wheat, and they're just as important. We only really hear about the gluten. So you can just as easily react to these other things as you can to gluten. So, for example, you can have positive antibodies to wheat, but not to gluten or to gliadin. And I've seen this happen many times. Now, then there are also reactions to things like the germ of the wheat, right? Or what we usually call wheat germ. Now, you might think of wheat germ as just a product that's in some other container, which it is, right? But remember, it's also actually a part of the wheat grain. And this is another important food reaction that can cause all the same symptoms that you can get from gluten, but it's not an actual gluten reaction. All right, well, that's a quick summary of how to test for gluten sensitivity and a bit about testing for wheat reactions as well. And keep in mind, if you've tested positive and removed gluten, but not gotten any better, then there's a lot more going on than just a gluten reaction. And that's what we help people figure out at the IBS Treatment Center. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more interesting information on how to be healthy. Thank you for watching.